A schoolteacher in Ireland once wrote 5 words in his diary that stopped historians cold. "We are the living dead." He wasn't describing a war. He wasn't describing a plague. He was describing his neighbors, his village, his country. And within weeks of writing those words, he was dead too. This is the story of history's most brutal famines. The ones that weren't just disasters, they were betrayals. Some were man-made, some were covered up, and some left behind warnings so terrifying, people carved them into stone so future generations would never forget. Let's get into it. The Irish Famine. We are the living dead. In 1845, Ireland descended into a nightmare. A potato blight wiped out the crop that millions of Irish people depended on to survive. What followed was 5 years of suffering so extreme, a schoolteacher named Gerald Keegan couldn't stop writing about it. Even as everything around him collapsed, Keegan kept a diary, and what he recorded inside it is almost impossible to believe. He wrote about walking along the roadsides and finding people face down in the mud, dead, with grass still in their mouths. They had been so desperate, so starving, that they had resorted to eating the ground beneath their feet. Dogs, donkeys, pets, anything. Scores of bodies simply left along the roads because there was nobody left strong enough to bury them. He wrote about the children. He said they looked like old people. Starvation had aged them beyond recognition. Gaunt faces, hollow eyes, bodies that had given up. Children who should have been running and laughing, looking like they had lived 100 years of suffering in just a few months. But perhaps the most haunting part of Keegan's diary is what he wrote about the ships. When the famine became unbearable, hundreds of thousands of Irish people tried to flee to America and Canada on what became known as coffin ships. Keegan was one of them. And as he boarded, he looked around at the other passengers and wrote that they looked like gaunt, emaciated bodies, spectres coming out of tombs. Below deck, the conditions were almost unimaginable. The stench of disease filled every corner. The sick lay next to the dying. And the dead, they were simply thrown overboard into the ocean. Keegan never made it to safety. His young wife died of fever somewhere on that journey. He buried her, alone, and kept only her shawl. Then he wrote his final entry. "I am alone now, and I feel I have nothing to live for. Eileen is dead. I only wish I were her." He died shortly after on a quarantine island off the coast of Canada. His body was buried there. His notebook was found by a priest. That notebook sat in obscurity for over 140 years. It wasn't published until 1991. For most of history, the world didn't even know it existed. Over 1 million Irish people died, another million fled, and one of the only first-hand accounts of what it really looked like almost never made it out. The Holodomor, the secret diaries they tried to erase. While Ireland's famine was caused by a natural blight, the famine that hit Ukraine in 1932 and 1933 had a very different cause. It was deliberate. Joseph Stalin's Soviet government had been seizing grain from Ukrainian villages, taking everything, leaving nothing. Ukrainian farmers who had grown food their entire lives were suddenly watching their children starve while Soviet officials carted their harvests away. Anyone who resisted was arrested. Anyone who spoke out was silenced. And anyone who wrote about it did so in secret, at enormous personal risk. A collection of 7 private diaries from people who lived through the Holodomor were discovered years later, hidden in Soviet archives. They had survived only because they were used as evidence in court cases against the people who wrote them. Let that sink in. People were arrested and put on trial for writing about what they witnessed. One diary belonged to a farmer named Nestor Bilus. He had kept a journal since 1911, recording the rhythms of village life, seasons, harvests. Then, in 1932, the entries changed. He began documenting what he called the complete destruction of the Ukrainian village by the Soviet government, day by day, village by village. A schoolteacher named Dorothea Federbush wrote with fury. She described seeing corpses in the streets of her town, bodies left in public, out in the open, because it was happening faster than anyone could respond. Her diary isn't calm or detached. It's outraged. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, and she needed someone, somewhere to know. Then there was Dmitry Zavoloka, a Communist Party official. He initially didn't believe the reports coming from the countryside. People were exaggerating, he thought. The government wouldn't do this. Then he visited the city of Borispol, and he wrote that what he found looked like a place destroyed by war, completely devastated, not by bombs, by hunger. Nearly all 7 diarists were later sent to labor camps or put on trial. Their notebooks survived as court exhibits. The Soviet government used their own private words against them, then buried those words for decades. Historians estimate that between 3.5 and 7 million Ukrainians died in the Holodomor. Stalin's government denied it was happening, and for years much of the world believed him. These diaries are some of the only proof of what ordinary people actually lived through. Gareth Jones, the journalist who knew too much. While Ukrainians were being silenced from the inside, one man tried to expose the truth from the outside. His name was Gareth Jones. He was a 27-year-old British journalist, and in early 1933 he did something almost no foreign reporter dared to do. He snuck into Soviet Ukraine without official permission and walked through the famine-struck villages alone. What he saw shattered him. Village after village, emptied. People skeletal, barely moving. In his diary, he recorded conversations with starving peasants who grabbed his arm and told him, "There is no bread. We haven't had bread for 2 months. A lot are dying." One man looked at him and said simply, "We are the living dead." Jones walked out of Ukraine and immediately published his findings. His article ran in the New York Evening Post with a headline that declared, "Famine on a colossal scale, impending death of millions. The world should have responded. Instead, it turned on him." The Soviet government called him a liar. And shockingly, some of his fellow foreign journalists, correspondents who had been living comfortably in Moscow, many of them sympathetic to Stalin's regime, backed the Soviets. The most prominent of them, a New York Times reporter named Walter Duranty, publicly dismissed Jones's reporting and won a Pulitzer Prize the same year. Jones was discredited, mocked, ignored. 2 years later, Gareth Jones traveled to Mongolia on another reporting trip. He was 29 years old. He was kidnapped and murdered under circumstances that were never fully explained. His original notebooks, the ones containing those diary entries from Ukraine, are now on display at Cambridge University. The man was silenced, but his words survived. The Bengal Famine, 3 million dead, while the world was watching. Here's the part of this story that will make you genuinely angry. In 1943, 3 million people in Bengal, part of British India, starved to death. 3 million. That's more than the entire population of many countries today. And Bengal had enough food to feed them all. This wasn't caused by drought. It wasn't caused by a failed harvest. The rice was there. The food existed. What killed 3 million people was a series of decisions made by people in power who simply prioritized something else. Britain was at war, and the British government was terrified of a Japanese invasion of India. So they began implementing what they called denial policies. In practice, this meant systematically removing anything that could be useful to an invading army, including boats, including carts, including the fishing canoes that Bengali fishermen used to feed their families and communities. At the same time, large stocks of food were being reserved for the military. Grain was being exported to other war fronts. The message to ordinary Bengalis, even if it was never spoken out loud, was clear. The soldiers come first. Panic spread. People who had food started hoarding it. Prices exploded. And ordinary workers, people who had been feeding their families just months before, suddenly couldn't afford rice. The market had collapsed around them. Relief came. The British government did eventually distribute over 110 million meals, but the scale was so catastrophic that it barely scratched the surface of the need. 3 million people died. Not because the food wasn't there, but because of who controlled it and what they decided it was for. Studies have since laid direct responsibility on wartime policies pushed by Winston Churchill, who reportedly dismissed concerns about the Bengal famine with indifference. It is one of history's most uncomfortable truths that one of World War II's most celebrated leaders presided over one of World War II's deadliest famines, and almost nobody knows about it. The Hunger Stones, warnings carved into rivers. The final story isn't about a single famine. It's about what people did to make sure their descendants never forgot. For hundreds of years, people in Central Europe had a problem. Droughts would come, rivers would drop, harvests would fail, famines would follow. And then, a generation later, it would happen again. And the new generation had no idea what was coming. So they carved the warnings into stone and placed them in the rivers. These became known as hunger stones. Large boulders inscribed with dates and messages, placed at points in rivers like the Elbe, where the water level dropping was the earliest warning sign of drought. When the stones were visible, when the water had dropped low enough to reveal them, it meant famine was coming. The most famous hunger stone sits in the Elbe River near Děčín in what is now the Czech Republic. It dates back to 1616. Carved into its surface in German are 5 words: Wenn du mich siehst, dann weine. If you see me, weep. That was the message. Not just there's a drought, not just water levels are low, but weep, because you know what comes next. On that single stone, you can read dates carved by different hands across different centuries. 1417, 1473, 1616, 1778, 1893, 2003. Each one representing a year of drought so severe that someone felt the need to mark it, to tell whoever came next, we were here, we suffered. Do not be surprised when it happens to you. For a long time, these stones were largely forgotten, sitting underwater through generations of normal rainfall, invisible, irrelevant. Then, in 2018, a severe European drought hit. Rivers dropped to historic lows, and the hunger stones re-emerged. The stone that had been underwater for years was suddenly visible again, and the message carved into it 400 years ago felt, to the people who read it, like it had been written yesterday. If you see me, weep. Some warnings don't need to be explained, they just need to survive long enough to be read.
If you learned something new, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.